There was just so many things that I just rolled up my sleeve, learned, and then was able to do with a really wide variety of clients and partners. And it was terrific.
Or how do we potentially gain business from this podcast? I'm like, well, why don't we ask what about the story itself? Is the content compelling enough for me to want to continue to consume it? Does it resonate with your ideal audience or your niche?
Don't imitate, because no one's going to care, if you just do a knockoff of something else. What is it you want to say? And it's a harder row to hoe, but it's worth it in the long run.
No one makes magic in business like Disney. Join us as we hear from Disney cast members, influencers, and enthusiasts to uncover the secrets of what it takes behind the scenes to make Disney such a successful and well-loved brand. We will hear their journeys, inspirations, and have some good old-fashioned Disney fun along the way. So relax, pull up a chair, be our guest, and let's get down to Bippity Boppity Business. Hello and welcome to Bippity Boppity Business. My name is Rita, and today we have a very special guest, Senior and Vice President at Mattel, Inc., Christopher Keenan. Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rita.
It's a pleasure having you here. I'm really excited to talk to you about a couple of themes that we're currently exploring on the podcast, relating to infusing wonder in our work and also creative content storytelling and strategy for businesses that don't normally work in this creative niche or field that you work in the entertainment industry. But
Great.
Before we get into any of that, I have a question for you.
Sure.
When was the first time in your life that you felt a creative spark and the desire to write or create in any way?
Wow. Boy, that goes back to really some of my first memories. In fact, it's funny that I'm sitting in this room. There's a framed photo, a framed piece of artwork on the wall behind me, which is a drawing on a paper towel from when I was 4 years old. And it was a drawing of a dog, which looks like a multi-limbed rhinoceros or something. But it was at 4 years old, and my aunt was so impressed with the drawing and the description of the drawing and the explanation as to what it was and what it was doing, that from a very young age, I think, she decided to save and frame it. And from a very young age, I wanted to tell stories. So that my earliest memories are all about telling stories, and I used to draw them out, in pictures all the time.
That's so beautiful. I really resonate with that. My mom said when I was younger, especially in pre-K, my teachers would tell her that I always would come up with these wild explanations or stories as to why I wouldn't want to do something. And I was a bit of a troublemaker. And one of my teachers once said for a parent-teacher conference that one of my reasonings for not wanting to clean up was that I was a princess. And princesses don't have maids. They have help. They live in a castle. They're very well-to-do. And I didn't have time. I was too busy ruling a kingdom in order to participate in cleanup time at pre-K. So growing up, my mom always told me that I don't know what you're going to be, but hopefully you're good at storytelling when you do it, because if not, we're going to be in trouble. But I love hearing the essence of how you started and your creative journey, because I think what a lot of creators can look at or feel when we see many successful people is a sense of almost, I can't do that, or I don't know if I will be able to do what this person has done. But at the end of the day, we all get to where we're going because of our original passion and desire for wanting to create. So, speaking a little bit more about your creative background and your journey, I'm curious to hear about how you got your start into the industry you're in now. You're doing all these great things with Mattel, but I'm sure when you first graduated, you didn't just magically become senior vice president of what you're doing now. There was a journey to get there.
No, there was definitely a journey, and it actually started probably about midway through, early high school, in that when I was initially, a high school student, I took a lot of pride in being really good at bad things. In other words, if I could get in trouble for it, I got in trouble for it, and always in a big way.
Seems like we would have been friends in school.
Well, but the consequence, or not the consequence, but part of that was, a lot of peer pressure, a lot of
Mm.
trying to fit in, all those things. And it wasn't until I switched schools in my early sophomore year that I went to this Quaker co-educational boarding and day school that other people locally referred to as hippie high. And what it allowed me to do, it was a whole school, very small school, but a whole school full of really individual and unique students from all around the world. And there were none of the sort of cliques and groups and things that I was accustomed to in a public school. And for the first time, I was able to sort of creatively come out of the closet, as they say. And I started doing theater, and I started singing, and I started writing, and all the things that I had been passionate about as a kid and sort of gave up during adolescence and my teenage years. And finally was able to pursue the things that I loved, and it was accepted. And that really sort of put me on this track, in the sense that I knew I wanted to work in entertainment of some kind, but I also had a real passion for education and for working with kids. And so I really was struggling with how the two could come together. And I'll never forget hitchhiking to school one day. An elderly woman picked me up, and she, it was closer to graduation. She said, "So what are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do in college?" And
Don't you hate that question? You're
I
like,
know.
oh man, I'm just trying to figure it out.
Well, I literally said I can't decide, if I want to go, be a playwright or an actor, or if I want to teach fourth grade. And she said, "Put them together, Sesame Street." And it was such an eye-opening moment. It was a real epiphany where I thought, wow, I can actually bring this to get all my sort of passions together. So that's a really long-winded way of saying once I got into college, I, literally pursued both. I pursued early childhood education and child development and theater and film and television. And when I graduated, I had every intention of working in either children's theater or educational theater of some kind. But I moved to Los Angeles and was working for a theater in Los Angeles doing script coverage, doing synopses and evaluations of scripts that would come into this theater. And it was a pretty well-known big theater at the time, and still is.
Yes.
But it didn't pay very well. So I took a job as a receptionist. Actually, it was called a security receptionist. And
Really?
my job was to, dress nicely, smile a lot, and buzz people in through the security door saying, "Good morning. Bzz, good morning." Bzz."
Right. May I take your hat, sir? Right this way.
Not even that. All I did was say good morning and press a button. That was the extent of my skills. But the great thing was it allowed me time to read my scripts and do my synopses and do my evaluations on the clock while I was also getting paid to be a security receptionist. But that job led to another job when there was an opening at Warner Brothers for a similar role. It was a receptionist job at their production office for Tiny Toon Adventures, which was Warner Brothers television animation's first foray into animation since
Wow.
classic animation with Looney Tunes. And I literally took the job because it paid better, and I thought, why not? But during the time I was there, early on during Tiny Toon Adventures, this was really pre computers. I worked on
Yeah.
a writer, and I volunteered to type the recording scripts for the animation, because the writers would write them in one format, but they needed to be reformatted to work for the voice director and the cast, with individual lines of dialogue numbered and that sort of thing. And since I didn't have a lot to do at my desk, I volunteered to do that. And in doing that, I I found myself being incredibly interested in what it was we were saying to the kids at home, meaning it was strictly comedy. It was sort of, if you're familiar with Tiny Toon Adventures, the Tiny Toon characters are sort of junior versions of all the beloved Warner Brothers characters.
It's like
But there was
slapstick and very like much that energy of comedy.
totally,
And it's not like a Sesame Street episode where I
no,
learn about the meaning of life or anything.
not at all, not at all. But there were two different episodes, one in particular that really bugged me, frankly. And in it, I don't even want to say the episode, but in it, Buster Bunny told the boys at home that you should always go out with the girl with the bunny with the biggest ears. And
Oh.
Babs Bunny was telling all the girls at home that you should always go out with the bunny that makes the most allowance. And it really got under my skin. And I just kept thinking about what it was saying and how, this was something that was, going to be Warner Brothers, sort of big marquee, foray into television animation. And it just bugged me. And so I wrote an essay called Substance and Responsibility. And I wrote it more for my own sort of catharsis.
You're
Um,
like, I need to get this out of my system and journal it. Yeah.
Exactly. And then in turn, I shared it with someone who was a friend who happened to work in development for the president of the division. And I guess I'm not quite sure exactly how this unfolded, but basically she then sent it to someone at Amblin, which was Steven Spielberg's company, who was executive producing the show. And the next thing I knew, the president of the division was walking in, holding it, saying, "Did you write this?" And I was sort of like, but it led to a relationship with her. And she took
Yeah.
me out to breakfast and we got talking about, my interests and my background and my, education and this and that. And she said, what would you like to do here if you had the ideal job? And I said, oh, I don't know, development, working with writers, working with scripts. And she said, and what would you be called? And I was like, supervisor of development. I don't know. She said, and how much would
Yeah,
you
like
get
how
paid?
the opportunity to be even asked that question while you're a receptionist somewhere is mind blowing.
Well, truly, I thought this was all just a theoretical conversation. And when she asked how much would you get paid, I'll never forget. I said 22,000 a year. And she's like, well, why don't you go back, write that all down, and that'll be your new job. And I literally couldn't believe it. I was blown out of the water. And all I could think of was I should have asked for more money. But I ended up working for her directly and doing development. And I was completely new to this. I had enormous respect for all the different producers and writers involved. I was learning on the job, but I, had a lot of passion about how we entertain kids. And I ended up staying at Warner Brothers for, basically 19 years. I had left to go
Wow.
work at what was ABC Children's, back when ABC actually used to have a children's television block. And I did actually go and work at Amblin for a year as a feature animation story editor. But I returned to Warner Brothers when we launched Kids WB, the network there, and then stayed on up until about 2005 when I left and went on my own and started a small company to consult and develop and produce. And I
Yeah.
didn't intend to do that for a long time, but I did it for nearly 10 years. And it was a great run. But the greatest thing about it was I met so many people from all around the world, every aspect of the business, and truly, sort of dove into the deep end and learned all the other aspects of the business that I wasn't familiar with in my more kind of cocooned world at Warner
Yes.
Brothers. So, whether it was voice directing or putting together an international co-production or acquiring rights to a literary property or selling shows on the international market. There was just so many things that I just rolled up my sleeve, learned, and then was able to do with a really wide variety of clients and partners. And it was terrific. And one of those clients was Hit Entertainment out of London. And I had been hired by them to, at one point, to develop my own property that I had pitched to them. But then after that, to help them develop some of their bigger brands that they were relaunching. And while I was consulting for them, one Thursday they phoned me and asked if I wanted to come run creative out of London. And I thought, okay. And being
Let
a
me just,
certain
clear out my schedule and I'll be there. And then behind the scenes, you're like, yes.
well, what's so funny is I'm a terrible negotiator. So that was a Thursday, and I was there on Monday, being like, okay, whatever, sounds good. Um, and it ended up being a really terrific job. I loved working for HIT. I loved working out of London. I would come back and forth frequently. And when Mattel itself, which was the sort of mothership, if you will, it had acquired HIT as one of the companies it acquired in the early 2000s, I I literally was asked to come back and run creative for what was then called Mattel Creations, and they would include HIT and American Girl and some of the other Mattel entities. And how could I say no? So I came
Right.
back um, and this has now been, I think I'm in my 8th year being employed by Mattel, and I never thought of myself as a toy person per se. Always very much a storyteller, and yet it's been nearly 8 years that I've been at Mattel, and I have to say I truly love it because
Yes.
it's a unique challenge in many respects, but I don't see much difference between what I'm doing now with established characters or brands or toys, and telling stories, about them or with them, from doing it with established characters from, a Warner Brothers library, for example. So that's
Yes,
how I got here.
absolutely. I
That's
love how you
that's
got here, and I
long-winded.
resonate to it on so many levels because I often in school was trying to also figure out how do I combine my love for child education and theater and business all together because I was asking the same questions as you. So it's phenomenal to hear how all of those pieces of the pie came together for you in the end, and what you're doing now is amazing. It makes me wonder too. So you're that creative, you have that level of passion, and you want to make sure that the message is valuable and properly impacts those who are consuming it, in this case, kids. But how do you balance those creative goals and the business goals and demands of the company together to create that compromise, profitable yet exciting and creative work that has to meet in the middle? Because I'm sure as an artist, not every idea that you have is accepted, or it has to be, modified a bit before we see it on the after the fact.
Well, it's a terrific question, and literally when I started my own company, one of the ways I would pitch it, it was called Creating for Kids. One of the ways I would pitch it to potential investors or clients or partners was that I believe my skill is truly in show business. And by show business, I mean show and business. And it's really the marriage of art and commerce. And one of the things that I think a lot of writers, artists, show creators get sort of want to push back on is this idea that it's their creative vision, it's their story, it's their character. They find it difficult to compromise. And my feeling has been, and my position has always been, that there is a way to do both. I mean, if you want to write a script that doesn't need to make any money, then you can write that script, but you don't expect for anyone to pay for it, either to pay to acquire it or to pay to watch it. And so it's it's really, I think, finding the balance between true sort of artistry, whether it's storytelling or visual artistry, and commercial success. And so when, and actually, when I joined Mattel proper, I had a long talk with the president prior to coming back to the US, and explained that, my understanding is historically Mattel had done a lot of long form animated content that was really paid for out of marketing budgets for various brands to help support specific segments of a toy line or a particular product. And in many respects, it sort of rendered them elongated commercials more than anything else. And true, many of them were beautiful, many of them had great moments, but the entire purpose for their existence was to sell toys. And I was very blunt and direct and said, look, if you're looking for someone to do more of that, it's not me. You're sort of throwing your money away. There's plenty of people who can do that. I'm not opposed to doing that, but I'm looking for to do more than that. This is that to me,
Yes.
that's sort of what pays for the bread and butter and keeps the lights on, but then allows you to do other things that are more about the messaging or the overall kind of ethos of a character or brand, and more entertainment than commercial. That's
Yeah.
sort of where my heart lies. But it's finding that balance, because even in doing that, there are certainly commercial concerns that need to be taken into account. Um,
Yes.
and it always goes back to if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, does it really make any noise? So, I can write the greatest story ever, but if nobody actually wants to pay for it, what have I accomplished other than, expressing myself like my back in my substance and responsibility essay?
I'm over here just taking notes. If you see me looking down of what you're saying, I'm just like, oh, this is so good. Because
Thank
it's
you.
so true. We have to balance that. And something that I'm really exploring is, as I help businesses with their podcast production, they ask me, well, how do we get to listen or how do we potentially gain business from this podcast? I'm like, well, why don't we ask what about the story itself? Is the content compelling enough for me to want to continue to consume it? Does it resonate with your ideal audience or your
Mhm.
niche, your target buyer? And those are such great questions to answer. And I wonder for you, I would like to know your theory on what turns that passive follower or whatever in your industry it may be to that super fan consumer. Is it the messaging? Is it the community element? Like, I just want to know your theory.
Sure. I mean, my theory is pretty simple, which is that audiences or consumers want to spend time with characters and stories that really resonate for them, that they can relate to, and that they enjoy. And sometimes there's elements of aspiration or wish fulfillment, but the bottom line is that if an audience member or a consumer absolutely loves a character or a world or a story, they want to engage passively in watching the show. They want to engage physically in having the toy or the product or the game, whatever it may be. They want to talk about it. They want a community to be able to share with. And so the more different elements or different executions that a character or story can sustain, the better for the consumer or the audience member, often both, and the more likely you're going to breed super fans, in the sense that if there's all these various touch points and points of entry and ways to experience that character, that world, or that story, it just broadens and increases the potential for people to do so in all these different ways. And success leads to success. So if you have a highly successful television show, it can lead to a feature film, it can lead to a video game, it can lead to a theme park ride and a Broadway show and publishing.
Right.
You know, um, but often, one of the things that a lot of companies do, Mattel included, is think about things through a franchise lens. That it's not just a show or a toy or the strongest intellectual properties are those that at least have the potential to be realized in all these different ways, all these different executions or experiences or products. And I think it's that opportunity that leads to the super fans, because you can't have a super fan if there's nothing to experience.
Right. If
Um,
it's just transactional I know that there's a podcaster. His name is Jay Kunzo. He always talks about this. Your content can't just be transactional, it has to be transformational. We have to take us through the process. We have to experience it, resonate with it. And, this is something that people in business struggle with when they don't have a product, when they're a service based business. Somebody listening to this might be like, well, I work in finance. How do I do this for my listeners and my content? What would you say to that person? How would you creatively challenge them to look at their content in a different way?
Another excellent question. I think, and I have very little experience with finance, so
That's
I
okay,
won't
but
comment
that's
on
why I want to
finance.
ask you from
Um,
this lens.
but I think it's about a never-ending story, meaning there's if what you are putting out there or sharing or selling is finite, then I can have that experience or buy that product, but there's an end to it. And why would I continue to pursue, more if I know that it's finite? If there, if if you've said all there is to say about financial matters or all you have to say, I'm not going to keep tuning in just to hear the same thing. So it's about infinite discovery, I guess. And that sounds very heady, but I mean, whether it's financial planning or telling a fairy tale, telling a story, the more sort of breadth and depth there is to what it is you're offering, and the revelation of that breadth and depth over time, the more I believe you ensure people coming back for more, digging
Yes.
deeper, exploring it in different ways. I'm working very well. A lot of the work I'm doing right now focuses on content around the character of Barbie. And I say the character, not the doll, because the doll is handled by another division. But
Mm-hmm.
the character of Barbie has evolved, tremendously over the last decade. And that content universe around that character has also just continued to expand and evolve. And I believe that a lot of the reason we have such Barbie super fans of the content is because it's not a one and done. It wasn't just, a single animated special. It was, a whole suite of content that's always looking at her universe, her friends, her point of view, her
Yeah,
experience.
and her stories never end. She's a astronaut, she's a writer, she's this. It's unlimited. The abilities are all there. And something else that I really think is interesting with the stories of Barbie is, Saturday morning cartoons aren't as much as a thing anymore with us as kids. But
Right.
now Barbie's a vlogger on YouTube. Like it's like such a creative switch, and I want to talk a little bit about that briefly. It's like, technology is changing and we're having parasocial relationships with characters or brand entities, representatives. How do we innovate in the digital era and create content that performs well and resonates with that kind of an audience?
Well, it's interesting. Vlogger, I think, is a phenomenal example of a character and entertainment, shifting and evolving in response to, audience demand and the times, really. Um,
Yes.
there's two women in particular who were behind the conception of Vlogger. Producer Julia Pister, and a creative executive Teal Sperling, and they really envisioned a a place for Barbie to speak directly to girls and to share her experiences as a young teen, growing up in America today. And it's a very different place than it's been over the decades. And this was in tandem with, in addition to the sort of narrative storytelling we were doing,
Mm.
establishing the character of Barbie as a 17-year-old who moved from Wisconsin with her family and lives in Malibu and goes to high school. But all of those things were sort of created in an animated series, but Vlogger gave Barbie herself a showcase to speak directly to the audience. And
Yes.
what was amazing is that we were able to to write and produce a number of vlogs. That there was a lot of, the fun internet challenges and just chit chat and current events, very lighthearted, very playful. But there were a number of vlogs that dug a little deeper into what it means to be young and female in a Western country. Um, I will never forget a particular vlog where Barbie talked about how she feels that girls apologize too much, and are always saying, I'm sorry. Or another one where she talked about the pressure to be happy all the time, and that sometimes she feels down and feels blue, and depression is a real thing, and a legitimate emotion. And then there was one not too long ago where she and her friend Nikki talked about racism, and I don't know
Mm.
if Barbie's ever talked about racism
Right.
before. And
It's so cool because, it goes back full circle to what you were talking about from the origin of your story, Christopher. The work is able to be deeper and connect at that level because we're talking about these concepts, but also I feel like the feedback loop of comments also is very important when you're adding and bringing people into that story. What do you think? Did that have a factor in the creation
oh,
as well?
absolutely. I mean, I, one of the true milestones, in my estimation, was when we started receiving comments from moms that were saying that it was the first time that they've ever considered Barbie a great role model for their daughter.
Wow.
And, even as a young adult myself, or an older teen, I have a lot of nieces and nephews. And I never would buy Barbies for my nieces because of all the baggage that came with Barbie, and you know
Hmm.
perceptions of female perfection and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
Um, and I wasn't a big fan until I started working for Mattel. And I don't mean that made me a fan. I mean, looking at how far the brand and the product team and the design team and the executive management of Mattel has been willing to go to make sure that Barbie, who's probably one of the most iconic female characters or people on the planet, actually was a positive influence on its target consumer and audience. And there's been so many changes in the way Barbie is depicted and talked about, and where the emphasis is put.
Right. It's not just about the content itself, but it's the impact that that content
Absolutely.
can potentially have. And I think when you can combine great stories, strong brand, content with purpose or impact that appeals to that emotion, I think that's a really beautiful cocktail or a recipe for successful work.
Yeah. Well,
So,
honestly, and I want to be really clear. I take credit for my participation in that. I certainly don't
yes.
take credit for the incredible strides that Mattel and the brand and the product and design team have made over the years. But the content piece, that has worked in tandem with all those efforts, is something that I'm incredibly proud of. Not just for myself, but the entire team. I mean, it definitely takes a village to produce
Absolutely. I
production.
think it's so good to know that it takes a village. You have to have your team aligned. You have to be believing in the mission and the heart of that story, as Disney would call it, the heart of the story, from what I've heard, right?
Yeah.
So I think what I would like to just like round out this conversation with is for those who are starting out, they want to have that moment, right, where they have sit at that receptionist desk and something big happens. How can they be prepared? And what are some things to keep in mind for those creatives, like understanding heart of story or whatever? There's so much to look at, but what's one thing where that they can do to start?
If I had to choose one thing, the one thing I would suggest, is to remember that the cliche is true. It's all about who you know. And I don't mean to say that talent and hard work and all those things aren't important, But without the connections, without someone else recognizing your work or your passion or your drive, it's really hard to move forward. And I think especially now in the age of social media and all the different ways to connect and network online, that the playing field has been evened out a bit. You don't need to live in Hollywood to meet people in Hollywood,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that I would say number one, make connections, attend online seminars, listen to podcasts, look at TED Talks, or, if you see the credits of a show you really like, look that person up online and see if there's contact information. I mean, the
I
more
do that all the time. I watch movie credits and try to add that person on LinkedIn. It's so funny.
Well, honestly, that people like to work with people they know, like, and trust. It's just human nature. And so that
Yes.
would be my very first sort of bit of advice. The second thing, and I'm sorry, I can't limit it to one.
Don't apologize. Bring it on.
The second thing is remember that no one has ever made it big by imitation. And there's a tendency, especially with people starting out, to look at something that's really successful or look at something that is popular and kind of try to have their work or their story fit that mold. And honestly, when you think about the biggest successes, they all came out of left field. They were all unexpected. They all went left when everybody else was going right. They stood out. And so I'm forever telling people who are, developing their own ideas or writing or drawing, don't imitate, because no one's going to care, if you just do a knockoff of something else. What is it you want to say? And it's a harder row to hoe, but it's worth it in the long run. And then the last thing I'll say is what is more critically important than anything else. Actually, I'm reminded of I've never forgotten this. My first year doing development at Warner Brothers, a writer gave me her business card. And on that business card, and I'm not going to name her name, but it literally said, so and so, a writer who writes. And I have never forgotten that, because so many people talk about, being a writer, being a storyteller, being an artist. And I'm like, well, what are you writing now? Well, I haven't really written in a while. Keep writing, keep drawing, keep producing, keep telling stories. If you are that storyteller or creator or artist or writer or business person, keep doing it. You want to be the writer who writes.
That's so profound. Christopher, thank you so much for being on the show. I could talk to you for 5 years, but maybe we'll see. Maybe when I am in LA one day, we'll grab a coffee or something. Who knows? To everyone listening out there, you heard it here. Bippity Boppity Business is not just about a girl who sounds like Minnie Mouse, but we're business here too. So maybe my little bit of deviation of the typical business podcast will be something that you hear on stage or somewhere else very time soon. I hope you guys all have a magical day, and thank you for tuning in. Bye. You've been listening to Bippity Boppity Business. Like what you hear so far? Leave us a review in Apple, or listen to us anywhere you prefer listening to your podcast. Until next time, have a magical day.